Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. I still think about the summer I was 16 and how it started with the best news I'd ever gotten. My cousin Delia, full name Adelina Runningwater, called me on a Tuesday afternoon in June and said her family had rented a cabin up near the Flathead Lake area for 2 weeks and did I want to come. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. Delia and I had been close our whole lives, grew up going to the same powwows, spending summers at each other's houses, sharing clothes and secrets and bad ideas. Her friends were going too. A girl named Shauna Bearcrane who I'd met a few times and liked well enough, and a boy named Marcus Two Bears who Delia had been talking about for months in that way she talked about boys she liked. I figured it would be 2 weeks of lake water and campfires and staying up too late. I packed my favorite green hoodie, my journal with the black cover that I wrote in every single day, my grandmother's small beaded bracelet that I never took off, and enough clothes for the trip. My mom zipped up my bag and kissed my forehead and told me to behave. I told her I always behaved. She laughed like that was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. The cabin was beautiful in that way that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever happen there. It sat maybe 40 yards back from the lake, surrounded by ponderosa pines that were so tall you had to lean your head all the way back to see the tops. Inside it smelled like cedar and something faintly sweet like old candles. There were 2 bedrooms, a sleeping loft, a big stone fireplace, and a porch that looked straight out over the water. Delia's parents, Uncle Ray and Aunt Connie, had the main bedroom. Delia and Shauna and I took the loft. Marcus got the second bedroom to himself, which he was very pleased about. That first night we grilled hot dogs on the porch and watched the sun go down over the lake. And I remember thinking that this was exactly the kind of summer memory you keep forever. I felt happy in a way that felt solid, like standing on good ground. The first small thing happened on the 3rd day. I came up to the loft after swimming to grab my journal, because I'd had a thought I wanted to write down, and it wasn't in the side pocket of my bag, where I always kept it. I checked the main part of the bag. I checked under the pillow where I sometimes tucked it at night. I looked around the loft floor. Nothing. I told myself I'd probably just put it somewhere else without thinking. I borrowed a pen from Delia and wrote my thought on a gas station receipt instead and forgot about it for a while. That same evening I noticed my grandmother's bracelet was gone from my wrist. That one I couldn't explain away so easily. I never took it off. I'd had it on that morning, I was almost certain. I turned my bag inside out. I pulled every piece of clothing out and shook it. I checked the bathroom, the porch, the area around the fire pit. Aunt Connie helped me look for a while and told me it would turn up. That thing's always turned up in small spaces. Uncle Ray said I probably left it at home. I didn't argue with him, but I knew I hadn't left it at home. I knew I'd felt it on my wrist that morning when I was putting on sunscreen. By the end of the first week I was missing 3 things: the journal, the bracelet, and my green hoodie, which I'd hung on the peg by the front door, and one morning it was simply gone. Shauna said maybe it fell outside. Marcus said maybe a raccoon dragged it off, and then laughed like that was hilarious. I didn't think it was very funny. I started keeping my bag zipped and shoved under my sleeping bag at night. I started paying attention to things in a way I hadn't before. And I started noticing other things, small and hard to name at first, like the way Shauna and Marcus sometimes stopped talking when I walked into a room. Not always, just sometimes, enough that I noticed. And the way Delia would laugh a little too quickly at things that weren't that funny, like she was covering something over. And there was one night, maybe the 8th night, when I woke up around 2 in the morning needing water, and I came down from the loft and I heard voices out on the porch, loud and close together. I could hear Shauna's laugh, that specific high sound she made. I heard Marcus's voice saying something I couldn't make out, and I heard Delia, and something in the tone of it stopped me at the bottom of the stairs. I stood there in the dark kitchen for a long moment, not moving, and then I went and got my water and went back upstairs and lay there staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing. They were just up late. People stay up late at cabins, it didn't mean anything. But I started sleeping with my bag pressed against my back. The discovery happened on the 11th day, and it happened because I was looking for my journal again. I'd never fully stopped looking for it. I was in the loft while Delia and Shauna were down at the lake, and Marcus had driven into town with Uncle Ray for groceries, and I was going through Shauna's bag. I know how that sounds. I know. But I was going through her bag because she had a canvas tote that looked almost exactly like the one I'd had my journal in, and I thought maybe by accident she'd grabbed mine. I found the tote. It wasn't my journal, but underneath it, tucked between a folded sweatshirt and a toiletry bag, I found a small notebook with a purple cover, and I don't know what made me open it. I wish I could say I put it right back. I opened it. It was Shauna's handwriting, which I recognized from notes she'd passed Delia at the campfire. And the first page was nothing, just a list of songs she liked. And the second page was a drawing of something, I'm still not sure what. But the third page had my name on it. and Delia's name and a list underneath, and it took me a minute to understand what I was looking at, but when I did my hands went very cold. It was a list of my things. My green hoodie, with a little note next to it that said left pocket, pack of gum and lip balm kept it. My bracelet, with a note next to it that said better than I expected, real beads. My journal, with a note next to it that said she writes about everything, this is gold. And then below the list there were lines, just a few copied out of my journal. My own words. Private things I had written in the dark before bed about how I felt about a boy back home, about a fight I'd had with my mom before I left, about a dream I'd had that scared me. My own words, copied out in Shauna's handwriting in this little purple notebook, with comments next to some of them that I won't repeat. And at the bottom of the page in different ink, like it had been added later, Delia's handwriting. I knew Delia's handwriting as well as I knew my own, just 2 words next to one of the things I'd written. 2 words that meant she had read it too. That she had sat there and read my private words and added her own note. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it. I zipped Shauna's bag. I sat on my sleeping bag and I did not move for a long time. I was trying to figure out what I was feeling, and what I was feeling was something I didn't have a word for, something between sick and hollow, like the floor had dropped away somewhere deep inside me. I went down to the lake. I sat next to Delia. I didn't say anything about what I'd found. I watched her face while she talked and laughed, and I tried to find something there that explained it. Some sign that she knew what she'd done, some guilt, and I couldn't find it. She just looked like my cousin. She looked like the person I had trusted my whole life. I called my mom that night from the porch while everyone was inside watching a movie. I told her I wanted to come home. She could hear something in my voice and she didn't ask too many questions. She said she'd come get me first thing in the morning. I told Aunt Connie that night that I wasn't feeling well and I was going to head home early. She looked sorry about it. She didn't know. I don't think she knew. I slept with my bag in my arms. My mom picked me up at 7 in the morning. Delia came out on the porch when she heard the car and she looked surprised. And then she looked at my face and something shifted in hers. Not guilt, something else, something more like calculation. She said, "What's wrong? What happened?" I said I wasn't feeling good. She said, "Are you sure that's all it is?" And the way she said it, not worried, just watching me carefully, told me everything I needed to know about whether she understood what I might have found. I got in the car. We drove away. I watched the cabin get small in the side mirror until the trees covered it. I never said anything to Delia about what I found. I told myself it was because I didn't know how to start that conversation. But really, I think I was afraid of what she'd say. Afraid she wouldn't even apologize. Afraid she'd find some way to make it my fault for going through Shauna's bag. My grandmother's bracelet never came back. Neither did my journal. Neither did the hoodie. For a long time after that summer, things between Delia and me were just quietly broken. We saw each other at family things. We were polite. We did not stay up late talking anymore. That was almost 7 years ago. 2 months ago, I got a follow request on my private account from a name I didn't recognize. I almost accepted it without thinking. Then I looked at the profile picture. It was Shauna Bearcrane, just a different name now. A married name maybe, I don't know. The account had no posts. It was following 3 people. One of them was Delia, one of them was Marcus, and the third one was me. I don't know how she found that account. I don't know how long she's been watching it. I declined the request and set my account to more private and told myself it didn't mean anything. But last week, someone left a comment on a photo I'd posted. A photo of my hands, just my hands holding a cup of coffee, nothing identifying, and the comment said, "Nice bracelet." I wasn't wearing a bracelet. There was no bracelet in the photo. I deleted the comment, I deleted the photo. I've been checking my locks at night and I can't tell you exactly why, only that something in my body understands something my mind is still catching up to. Like whatever Shauna Bearcrane wanted from me that summer at the lake, whatever it was she was collecting. I don't think she's done collecting. Story 2, I know how it sounds when I tell people my family does this. I've watched their faces go through the whole thing, the polite smile, then the confusion, then that look where they're trying to decide if we're strange or just different. We're Blackfoot on my mother's side, mixed with a little bit of everything else on my father's, and the short answer is that we have always done things our own way. The longer answer is that ghost hunting, or whatever you want to call it, has been part of my family's life since before I was born. Not the television kind with the fancy equipment and the screaming. My Uncle Clifford started it years before I came along, and by the time I was old enough to participate, it had its own rules and its own rhythm and its own specific way of feeling, and to us it felt about as unusual as a family game night. I understand that to other people it sounds like we were asking for trouble. Maybe we were. But trouble in my experience doesn't wait for an invitation. There were 6 of us that night. My Uncle Clifford, who was 61 and had been doing this for 30 years and had the calm, steady manner of someone who had seen enough strange things that very little surprised him anymore. My older brother Darnell, who was 26 and treated the whole thing like a science project he was slowly compiling data for. My cousin Yolanda, who was my age, 23 at the time, and who I had done maybe a dozen of these with before. Her boyfriend Garrett, who was newer to it, had only come along twice before this night. And then there was a woman named Ruth Strikes Back, a friend of my uncle's from the tribal council, who had asked to come along and whom Clifford vouched for completely, which meant none of us questioned it. 6 people. I knew 5 of them the way you know the rooms of a house you grew up in. The location was an abandoned building on the edge of a small town about 2 hours from where we lived, an old community hall that had been closed for 15 years after a fire damaged the back section. Clifford had done the research, gotten permission from the property owner, which he always did, because one of his rules was that you never go somewhere you're not supposed to be. He said trespassing put a wrong energy on the whole night. His words, he had a lot of rules like that. The full list of rules, the way he explained them to Garrett and Ruth before we went in. You stay within sight or sound of at least one other person at all times. You do not run under any circumstances unless Clifford says run, because running causes panic and panic causes accidents. You do not provoke. No taunting, no dares, no aggressive language directed at whatever might be there. You mark your entry time and your exit time in the logbook. You carry a flashlight and a backup light source, and you do not let either one go dead without saying something. And finally, the one he was most serious about, if something feels wrong to you personally, you say so out loud immediately. You do not talk yourself out of it. You do not feel embarrassed. You say something feels wrong, and you say it right away. I had heard him give this speech many times. That night I listened to it differently than I ever had before. I don't know why. I think some part of me was already picking something up. We went in around 9:30. The building smelled like char and old wood and something underneath that. Something damp and organic that I couldn't place. The fire damage was in the back left corner. The ceiling there had partially collapsed years ago and nobody had cleared the debris, so there was a rough hill of burned timber and fallen plaster that we kept away from on Clifford's instruction. The main hall was large and open, with high windows that let in just enough moonlight to see by if your eyes adjusted, and rows of old folding chairs pushed against the walls, and a small raised platform at the far end that must have been a stage once. The floor was bare concrete, and our footsteps were the loudest things in the room for the first several minutes. Clifford set up the equipment the way he always did: 2 audio recorders on opposite sides of the room, a thermometer that logged temperature changes, a simple motion sensor by the main door we'd come in through, and a video camera on a tripod aimed at the stage area. Nothing complicated. He didn't believe in making it complicated. He always said the fancier the equipment people brought, the more they were looking for entertainment instead of truth. What he was interested in was documentation pattern, repetition over time. I had always respected that about him. For the first hour, nothing happened that you could point to. That's normal. That's almost always how it goes. What you're doing in that first hour is just being present in the space, letting it adjust to you or you to it, listening in a way that's different from how you usually listen. Yolanda and I walked the perimeter together, slowly, not talking much. Garrett stayed near Clifford, which made sense for someone still learning how to be in a space like that. Ruth Strikes Back moved quietly on her own, but always in the main hall, always visible. Darnell was checking the audio recorders periodically, writing in the logbook. The first thing I noticed, and I noticed it before I understood it, was that the motion sensor by the door went off twice in the space of about 10 minutes. This happens sometimes. A draft, a shift in air pressure, an animal outside moving close to the building. Clifford checked the door both times and said he didn't see anything and marked it in the logbook. I noted it, that's all. I noted it and kept walking. The second thing was a smell. This is going to sound like nothing, and when I tried to explain it later I couldn't make it sound like what it actually was. It was a smell like wet animal. Not the damp organic smell that was already in the building, but something warmer and closer, something that moved. Like it came from a source nearby that was not in the room before. Yolanda smelled it too. She looked at me when it hit us, and I could see in her face that she was running through the same explanations I was. A cat in the walls. Something that had gotten in through the damaged section. Something that had been here when we arrived and was only now moving. It was around the 90-minute mark that I first saw the figure at the edge of the stage. I want to be careful about how I say this because I've had people roll their eyes at me and I understand why. I'm not a person who sees things that aren't there. I've been in probably 20 of these locations over the years, and I can count on one hand the times I've seen something I couldn't explain, and 2 of those times turned out to have explanations. What I saw at the edge of the stage was a shape, a tall shape, standing very still at the left side of the platform where the light from the high windows didn't reach well. I stopped walking. I put my hand on Yolanda's arm. She stopped too. I pointed. The shape was too tall. That was the first problem. Too tall and too thin, and it was standing with a posture that was just slightly wrong. Shoulders not quite where shoulders should be, head at an angle that didn't match any position I could make with my own head comfortably. I stood there looking at it, and my mind was doing that thing where it tries to find the rational answer. A shadow, a piece of equipment we hadn't noticed, something draped over the old stage, and then the shape moved. Not a lot, just enough. A slow shift of weight, like a person rocking slightly from one foot to the other, and when it moved, the smell came again stronger. I said something feels wrong. I said it clearly and at a normal volume the way Clifford had taught us, And he was across the room, and he heard me, and he turned and looked where I was pointing. And what happened next is the thing I've gone over 100 times since, because it lasted maybe 4 minutes and it felt like 40. Clifford took 2 steps toward the stage and then stopped. He stopped in a way that was not like him. He was always the one who moved toward things, who got closer to understand them. He stopped and stood very still, and then he said, in a voice I had never heard him use, flat and very controlled, "Everyone move to the door right now. Do not run, move to the door." We moved to the door. I was watching behind us while we moved because I could not stop watching that corner of the stage. And the shape was still there, and it was still moving in that slow rocking way, and then it stepped off the platform. I heard the step. Concrete floor, a heavy sound, heavier than it should have been, and it started coming toward us, not fast, not chasing, just walking. But the distance between us was closing and the room was large and we were not at the door yet. Garrett grabbed the video camera off the tripod as we passed it. Darnell grabbed the logbook. I don't know why that's what we each grabbed. But you don't think clearly in those moments, you just grab what's closest. We got to the door and Clifford opened it and we went through and he pulled it shut behind us and then he said, "Now we run." And we ran. We ran back to the 2 cars we'd parked on the road and Clifford had his keys out before we reached them and we got in and drove away and nobody said anything for a long time. We found out later, when Darnell reviewed the audio recordings, the 2 he'd managed to grab on the way out, that there was a sound on both of them from the beginning of the night, before we had even gotten settled. A low rhythmic sound, consistent, regular, that none of us had heard in the room but that the recorders had caught. Clifford listened to it for a long time and said he didn't know what it was. He said he'd been doing this for 30 years and he didn't know what it was. He said that like it answered something. We never went back. Clifford filed a report with the property owner that said only that the location was not suitable for further visits. That was 3 years ago. Last month, Yolanda called me. She had been going through some boxes from that night. She'd taken a few things home in the rush, and she found one of the audio recorders. She thought she'd already reviewed it. She played it for me over the phone. At the very end of the recording, after the sound of us running, after the sound of the door, after everything, there was a voice, just barely, just at the edge of what you could hear. It said something short. I've listened to the clip she sent me 11 times now. I've asked 3 other people what they hear. We all hear the same thing, but none of us will say it out loud, because what it sounds like it says, is a name. And the name it says is mine. Story 3, the reason we went in the first place was money, and I want to be honest about that from the start because I think it matters. I was 24, working 2 part-time jobs, splitting a 1-bedroom apartment with my friend Nadine Swiftwind in a city that cost more every single month to live in. Nadine had grown up near the Crow Reservation and I was mixed Lakota on my dad's side, and we had known each other since community college, and we were the kind of broke that doesn't feel temporary anymore, the kind that starts to feel like the actual shape of your life. So when Nadine found the listing online, a farmhouse rental in rural Montana, 4 bedrooms, a full week for less than what we paid monthly for our apartment if we split it 5 ways, we did not ask enough questions. That's the honest version. The group was me and Nadine, a guy named Pete Many Horses who Nadine had grown up with and trusted completely, Pete's girlfriend Cheryl who I liked fine but didn't know well, and a woman named Josephine Tallbull who I had met exactly twice before this trip. 5 people, 1 car between us belonging to Pete, a shared grocery run the morning we left. Everyone's bags stacked so high in the trunk that Pete couldn't use his rearview mirror. We drove 4 hours north and then another 40 minutes on roads that got progressively smaller and less sure of themselves until the GPS gave up entirely and we were navigating by a screenshot Nadine had taken of the listing's written directions. Turn left at the grain elevator. Continue past the dry creek bed. The property will be on your right. Look for the mailbox with the reflective tape. We found it just before sundown, and I will say this at first look. It was beautiful in the way that empty land is beautiful when you've been living stacked on top of other people in a city. The farmhouse was 2 stories, white paint that had gone the color of old teeth, a porch that ran the full front length, a barn about 60 yards back that listed slightly to the left like it was tired. Around the house on 3 sides, flat land going out to a tree line in the distance. The sky was the kind of enormous you forget exists when you live somewhere with buildings blocking it. Nadine grabbed my arm when we got out of the car and said, "Tell me this isn't exactly what we needed?" And I said yes, I said it was exactly what we needed and I meant it. The inside was clean enough. Somebody had been there recently, not to fix anything, but to run a mop across the floors and put fresh garbage bags in the cans and fold the towels in the bathroom into neat thirds like a hotel. The furniture was old and mismatched. The kind of stuff that ends up in rental properties because it's not good enough for anyone's actual house anymore. But the beds had clean mattresses and the kitchen had a working stove and the water ran hot after about 45 seconds of waiting. Pete found a bottle of wine someone had left in the back of a cabinet, and we drank it on the porch watching the light leave the sky, and I felt myself relax in a way I hadn't in months. Josephine said she'd seen a listing for a spot like this once before but she'd missed it and she was glad she hadn't missed this one. Cheryl was already looking up hiking trails on her phone. The first small wrong thing happened before we went to bed that first night. I had put my phone on the kitchen counter to charge. There was a strip of outlets near the coffee maker, and when I came back for it around midnight, I found it moved. Not to another room, not gone, just moved to the other end of the counter, near the window that looked out toward the barn. I picked it up and looked at the window, and told myself Pete had moved it to plug something in, and in the morning I asked him and he said he hadn't touched it. Cheryl said she hadn't either. Nadine had been upstairs all evening. Josephine shrugged and said maybe she'd done it without thinking. I left it alone. It was a phone on a counter. The second day was genuinely good. We drove into the nearest town, a small place called Gallon with 2 gas stations and a diner and a hardware store, and we ate enormous breakfasts and drove back and spent the afternoon walking the land around the property. The tree line I'd seen from the porch turned out to be farther than it looked, maybe half a mile out, and the land between was flat and dry and full of the kind of grass that makes a constant low sound in any wind. We walked out to the trees and back. Pete and Cheryl walked with their hands linked. Josephine took photos of the sky on her phone. Nadine and I talked about nothing important, which is the best kind of talking. That night was when I heard it for the first time. I'm a light sleeper. I've always been a light sleeper, which in a city means you get used to noise and learn to sleep through it, but in a place that quiet the smallest sound carried differently. I woke up around 2:30 to something I couldn't immediately name. A rhythmic sound coming from outside from the direction of the barn. Slow and regular. Not a pump or a fan. Something that had a quality to it I can only describe as intentional, like something doing it on purpose. I lay still for a long time listening, and then I got up and went to the window of my bedroom, which faced toward the back of the property, and I looked out at the barn. There was a light inside it. Not bright, not like a floodlight or a flashlight, but a low steady glow, orange-yellow, visible through the gaps in the old boards. Like a lantern, and the sound was still happening, slow and regular. I stood at that window for probably 3 minutes. Then the light went out, the sound stopped. I stood there in the dark looking at the barn for another few minutes, and then I went back to bed, and I lay there until morning with my eyes open, and I did not sleep. I told Nadine at breakfast. She believed me immediately, which is one of the things I've always valued about her. She didn't explain it away or tell me I'd been half asleep. She just said, okay, and what do we do? Pete was less sure. He said old barns made sounds and animals got into them, and the light was probably moonlight coming through at an angle I hadn't accounted for. Cheryl agreed with Pete. Josephine was quiet for a moment and then said she hadn't slept well either, but she hadn't said why until now, and what she said was that she'd heard footsteps on the porch. She'd assumed it was one of us. She hadn't gotten up to check. We checked the barn that morning, all 5 of us, Pete with a piece of wood he'd picked up in the yard, because the rest of us weren't willing to tease him about it. Inside it was empty except for old hay on the floor and some rusted equipment along one wall. A manual plow, some hanging tools, a wooden crate full of glass bottles. The floor near the center was disturbed, the old hay pushed to the sides in a rough circle. Pete said that was probably where an animal slept. I looked at the circle for a long time. Animals don't make circles that neat. The third day, things shifted in a way that's hard to explain without sounding like I'm building to something. Except I'm not building to anything. Things just shifted. The mood in the group got tight. Cheryl and Nadine had a small argument about nothing, the dishes, something stupid, and it ended quickly but left a residue. Josephine spent most of the day by herself, which wasn't like her from what little I knew of her. Pete kept going quiet in the middle of conversation, staring at nothing. I felt it too, a kind of low-level pressure, like something in the air had a weight to it. I've felt that in cities before, that collective bad mood that spreads through a building when the weather is wrong or something has happened near B. But this was different. This was pointed. This felt like it was coming from a specific direction. That night around midnight, Pete's car alarm went off. We all came out on the porch. The car was in the dirt drive where we'd parked it, and all 4 tires were flat. Not one tire, all 4. Pete walked around it with his flashlight, very quiet, and when he came back to the porch, his jaw was set in a way I'd never seen on him. He said someone had cut the valves, not slashed the tires, cut the valve stems neat and deliberate, which meant we could reinflate them if we had a compressor, except we didn't have a compressor, and the nearest town was 40 minutes away on foot across land we didn't know in the dark. We went back inside and locked the door, and Nadine found a signal on her phone by standing on the 2nd floor landing, and she called the number from the listing. The host, a man named Dale. We had only ever texted with him before, picked up on the 3rd ring, and when Nadine explained what had happened, he was quiet for just a moment too long before he said he was sorry and he'd sort it out. Nadine asked him if this had happened before at the property. Another pause. He said no. She asked him if anyone else had access to the property. He said no, it was private land. She asked him who owned the barn. And he said, in a voice that was careful in a way that felt practiced, the barn isn't part of the rental. We stayed inside the rest of that night with the porch light on and nobody slept. In the morning, Dale sent a man with a truck and a compressor who didn't speak to us at all while he worked and didn't make eye contact when Pete tried to thank him. We had the car running by 10 in the morning and we loaded everything in under 30 minutes. I did one last walk through the house to make sure we hadn't left anything. In the kitchen, on the counter near the window that faced the barn, the same spot my phone had been moved to on the first night, there was something I hadn't seen before, a small piece of paper folded once. I don't know when it had been put there. I hadn't been in the kitchen in the past hour. I opened it. It was a hand-drawn circle, roughly the size of a fist, with a single line through the center. That was all. No words, just that. I took a photo of it and then I left it on the counter because I didn't want to take it with me. We drove the 4 hours back in almost total silence and I watched the land flatten out around us, and I kept looking in the side mirror at the road behind us, checking, for reasons I couldn't fully name and didn't want to. I've looked up that property since. I've tried to find it in county records and rental listing archives. I found an address that matches what I remember of the directions. The land is listed as belonging to a property management company with a name I couldn't find any other information about. No website, no reviews. When I search the address in a mapping application, the satellite image shows the farmhouse and the barn. But in the image, and I've zoomed in on this more times than I should have, the barn door is open, and there's a shape in the doorway. It could be anything. Debris a shadow, a problem with the image. I know it could be anything. But Dale never replied to the text Nadine sent him asking what the circle meant. Not that day, not in the weeks after. The number still exists, it rings, but nobody has picked up in 8 months. And sometimes, when I'm back in the city in my apartment with the door locked and the familiar sounds of neighbors on all sides, I think about that flat land and that enormous sky and the sound I heard coming from the barn in the dark, slow and regular and deliberate, and I think about the circle pushed into the hay on the floor, and I wonder how long someone had been out there. I wonder how long before we arrived. I wonder if they knew before we did, exactly when we were going to leave. Story forward, my grandfather, Joseph Three Bears, died on a Wednesday in October, and by the following Monday I was the only one left who would go into his house. That tells you something about my family, and about my grandfather, and about the kind of man he was in the last years of his life. My mother hadn't spoken to him in 6 years. My uncle Dennis had driven up from Billings for the funeral and left the same evening, shaking his head in a way that meant he was done with something. My Aunt Pauline, who had stayed closest to him geographically, handled the funeral arrangements with the efficient and detached manner of someone completing an obligation, and she handed me the house keys at the reception and said, "You were always the one he liked." And then she got in her car. I was 28. I had liked my grandfather once, but the man who died in October was not quite the man I had liked, and I think everyone in my family knew that, and I think that's why the keys ended up in my hand. The house was a small 2-story on the edge of a town that had been shrinking for 30 years, the kind of town where half the storefronts downtown had brown paper in the windows. My grandfather had lived there alone since my grandmother passed, which was 12 years before him. The neighbors on both sides had told Pauline separately, without being asked, that in the last year or two he had stopped coming outside much. One of them said she used to see lights on at all hours. The other one, an older man named Carver who had known my grandfather for decades, said only that he had changed and looked away when he said it, like he didn't want to say more. I went in on a Tuesday with a box of garbage bags and the intention of getting it done efficiently. The living room was fine, sparse, a little dusty, furniture that had been old when I was a child and was now simply ancient. The kitchen was clean in the obsessive way of someone with too much time and too little else to focus on. Everything lined up with a precision that felt anxious rather than neat. The bathroom upstairs told me he hadn't been sleeping in the bedroom. There was a pillow and a folded blanket on the bathroom floor near the wall, and a ring of salt along the baseboard that had been there long enough to yellow. I stood in the bathroom doorway and looked at that salt for a long time. The bedroom was locked. Not just closed. Locked, with a key lock that had been added to the door, new hardware on an old frame, the kind of thing you buy at a hardware store and install yourself. The key was not on the ring Pauline had given me. I found it eventually taped to the underside of the kitchen table in a small envelope with my name on it, and I stood there holding the envelope for a moment because my grandfather had put my name on it. He had expected me to be the one to find it. He had planned for this. The bedroom smelled like old smoke and something underneath that I couldn't name, something that made me think of wet earth and old pennies. The curtains were pulled and nailed, actual small nails driving through the fabric into the window frame. Every surface, the dresser, the nightstand, the top of the wardrobe, the floor along all 4 walls was covered in objects. Candles burned down to flat discs of wax. Small bundles of herbs gone gray and dry. Photographs, dozens of them pinned to the wall above the headboard. Bowls with things dried up in them that I didn't examine closely. And notebooks, maybe 15 of them, stacked and scattered across the bed and the floor, all the same kind. Black cover, college ruled, filled in my grandfather's handwriting that had gotten smaller and tighter as they went on. The later ones almost too small to read without leaning close. I took the notebooks. I left almost everything else. I didn't know why I took the notebooks specifically. I think I understood already at some level that they were the thing I was meant to take, that he had left them for me the way he had left me the key. I brought them home to my apartment and I stacked them on my kitchen table, and I didn't open them for 3 days. The first night after I brought them home, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the smell of smoke. Not strong, just a thread of it enough to wake me. I checked the apartment. Nothing burning, no candles lit, no explanation. I opened a window and went back to bed. The second night I heard my grandfather's voice. I know how that sounds, and I'm not going to try to make it sound better than it is. I was between sleeping and waking, and I heard his voice, clearly saying my name, my full name, Nathaniel, which almost nobody used in the tone he used when I was a child and had done something he needed to talk to me about, patient, serious. I sat up and the room was empty and quiet, and I turned on every light and sat at the kitchen table until morning. I opened the first notebook the next day. He had started them about 8 years before he died. The first few read like a journal, daily life, notes about the weather, observations about the town. But by the third notebook, something had shifted. He was writing about a practice he had gotten into, and he was writing about it the way you write about something you've already committed to, not something you're considering. He didn't name it directly. He referred to it as the work, always lowercase, always with a kind of plain familiarity that made it worse somehow. Like it was just a thing he did now, like checking the mail. The work involved the objects I'd found in the bedroom. The candles, the herbs, the bowls. Rituals he described in enough detail that I could follow them, but not enough that I could understand their full purpose. What I could understand was the intent. He was trying to reach something. Or rather, he had reached something years ago, and was now in an ongoing relationship with it that had changed the shape of his life entirely. The photographs above the headboard, I understood by the fifth notebook, were not random. They were people he had been asking for things on behalf of. Petitions, he called them. He had been doing this for others, quietly, without advertising it. People came to him and he interceded for them through the work, and sometimes the work answered in ways that helped, and sometimes it answered in ways that didn't, and the difference, he wrote, was not always within his control. By the seventh notebook, he had stopped doing it for others. He was only doing it for himself. And what he was asking for, in those later notebooks, I had to read 3 times to be sure I understood. He was asking it not to take him. He had started the work believing he was in control of it. That was clear in the early notebooks. The confidence of a man who thinks he has found something that serves him. By the middle notebooks, the confidence had become management, careful and constant, the way you manage something that has grown larger than you expected. By the last notebooks, it was something else. He was negotiating. He was making agreements. He was giving things in order to get more time. The salt along the bathroom baseboard, the locked bedroom, the nailed curtains. These were not rituals. These were barriers. He had been keeping it out of certain rooms. Or trying to. The last notebook stopped mid-sentence. Not at the end of a page, not at a natural pause. Mid-sentence, mid-word, almost like he'd been interrupted. The pen had dragged across the page when it stopped, leaving a long line that ran off the edge of the paper. I should have burned the notebooks. I know that now. I know it in a way that sits in my chest like a stone I carry everywhere. I should have burned them and whatever was in those bowls and the photographs and the curtains and maybe the house itself. Instead, I kept reading, which I think was what I was supposed to do, what he had arranged for me to do, and by the time I understood that it was too late. The things that started happening in my apartment, after I finished the last notebook, I will describe only briefly, because I don't want to put too much of it into words, because I have come to believe that putting it into words gives it something. My sleep stopped being something I came back from feeling rested. I would wake in the morning more tired than when I lay down, with a heaviness in my chest and the persistent sense that the night had not been empty. Objects moved, not dramatically, not thrown across rooms, just relocated slightly, the way they were in my grandfather's house when I first walked through. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to bother me in a way I could not explain, and eventually I covered it. The smell of smoke came back and never fully left. I went to see Carver, my grandfather's old neighbor, because I felt like he knew something. He opened his door and looked at me for a long moment before he let me in. We sat in his kitchen and I asked him what he knew about my grandfather's last years, and he was quiet for a while, looking at his hands. And then he said he came to me about 4 years ago. He asked me if I knew anyone who could help him close something he'd opened. I asked him if he found anyone. Carver said he found someone, but it didn't hold. He said Joseph told him that what he'd been working with for years didn't respond the same way to being closed as it had to being opened. That some of it was already too settled to move. Too settled. I've thought about those words every day since. I don't live in my apartment anymore. I moved thinking that the objects were tied to the place. Some things improved. The mirror doesn't bother me the same way. The smell comes and goes instead of staying. But the sleep hasn't come back, not fully, not in the 2 years since I finished those notebooks. I wake in the early morning hours with my grandfather's voice at the edge of it, patient and serious, saying my full name. And I have started, in the past few months, to understand something that I really wish I did not understand. When he locked his bedroom and nailed the curtains and slept on the bathroom floor, he was not keeping something out. He was keeping something contained. Something he had let settle in over years of practice. Something he had fed and worked with and negotiated with until it knew him deeply, until it was shaped around him, comfortable with him. And when he died, whatever he had built that relationship with needed somewhere to go. And he had left me the key. He had taped it to the underside of the table with my name on it. He had left me the notebooks in a locked room that only I would open. He had planned for this, carefully, and I had walked in and picked up the key and done exactly what I was meant to do. I was 28 years old and I walked into that house and I inherited something that my grandfather spent the last years of his life trying to manage, and I did it freely, without anyone forcing me, and now it's settled. And Carver's word lives in me like something with roots. I wake in the dark and I hear my name and I lie still and I think about my grandfather on the bathroom floor in the dark, keeping watch, and I understand now what he was watching for. And I understand that I will be doing the same thing for the rest of my life. Story 5. The job listing said Overnight Inventory Coordinator, which is a title that means almost nothing and is designed to mean almost nothing. And I applied for it because I was 11 days from being unable to pay rent, and the listing promised immediate placement and a starting rate that was 40% higher than anything else I'd found in 3 weeks of looking. I was 31 years old, recently laid off from a logistics company that had dissolved quietly and without warning, and I had a car payment and a lease and a student loan that didn't care about any of that. My name is Daniel Bearchief and I am a practical person. I applied for the job because I needed the job. That's the whole story of how it started. The company was called Meridian Storage Solutions, which sounds like a self-storage place and is designed to sound like a self-storage place. The address was a large warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, the kind of area where all the buildings look the same at night, flat-roofed, metal-sided, lit by sodium lights that make everything the color of old bruises. I drove there for the interview on a Thursday evening and met a man named Hargrove, no first name ever offered, who was thin and unhurried and asked me very little about my work history and a great deal about my living situation. Did I have family nearby? Did I have a spouse or partner? Was I the kind of person who had people checking in on me regularly? I told myself these reliability questions. Background screening. The kind of thing companies ask now. I told myself that and I believed it because I wanted to believe it, because the rate he quoted me at the end of the interview was even higher than the listing and I could feel my bank account balance like a weight behind my eyes. I started the following Monday. Night shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. There were 4 other night shift workers when I started. A woman named Greta who was maybe 50 and had the manner of someone who had worked nights for so long that daytime felt foreign to her. She moved and spoke with a deliberate slowness that I first read as unfriendliness and later understood as something else. A younger man named Corey, maybe mid-20s, who was friendly in a way that had a lid on it. Like friendliness, he was rationing. A man named Stills who barely spoke to anyone and communicated mostly in nods. And a woman named Priya who had been there, she told me, for about 7 months, and who trained me on my first night with a thoroughness that felt, in retrospect, less like helpfulness and more like she was making sure I understood something specific. The job itself was straightforward on the surface. The warehouse held inventory for what I was told were medical supply companies and research contractors. Boxes and pallets arranged in numbered sections, tracked through a logistics software I was trained on in about an hour, logged and verified on a rolling nightly schedule. Walk the sections, scan items, log discrepancies, simple. I had done versions of this before and I was good at it. The rules were where it started to get strange, and I want to be specific about the rules because I think about them often, and I think the specificity matters. Rule 1, Section 7 was off limits to all night shift staff. Not restricted in the way of sensitive inventory. There was no keypad, no special access level in the software. Just a rolling metal gate that was always down and a set authorized personnel only in plain black text. Day shift handled Section 7. We were told this once and not told why. Rule 2. If you heard sounds from Section 7, you logged nothing and said nothing and continued your route. Priya delivered this rule in the same tone as all the others, practical and flat, and I remember looking at her face while she said it and finding nothing there that invited me to ask a follow-up question. Rule 3, the loading dock on the north side of the building. Not the main dock, a secondary one I hadn't noticed on my first walk through, was never to be approached between 2 and 4 in the morning. There was no explanation attached to this rule. When I asked Priya why, she said, because that's the rule, and moved on to the software training. I followed the rules for the first week and a half. I walked my sections and scanned my items and logged my discrepancies and exchanged quiet small talk with Greta and Corey, and said goodnight to Stills at the end of each shift. The warehouse at night had its own sounds. The settling and ticking of a large metal structure, the ventilation system, the occasional shift and creak of stacked pallets. I got used to these sounds the way you get used to the sounds of a new apartment. I slept during the day in the particular thick way of people who work nights, and I paid my rent and my car payment, and I told myself the rules were just rules, the kind of thing every workplace had. The kind of thing that seemed strange from outside and made sense once you knew the context. On the 11th night, Corey didn't come in. No call, no message in the shift log. Greta said he'd quit, said it with her eyes on her scanner, not looking at me. I said I was surprised he'd seemed settled in. Greta said people left sometimes and then was quiet in a way that closed the subject. On the 14th night, I heard sounds from Section 7. I was on the far end of my route, about as close to the Section 7 gate as I got during a normal walk, and the sounds were not subtle enough for me to pretend I hadn't heard them. They were rhythmic and low, and they came in sets. 3 sounds close together, then a pause, then 3 more. And they had a quality I keep coming back to even now, years later, because it's the quality that tells you the difference between a machine and something that isn't. Machines don't have weight to their sounds. Whatever I heard in Section 7 had weight to it. I stood still in the aisle for maybe 30 seconds and then I moved on. I logged nothing. I said nothing. I started watching Priya more carefully after that. She had been there 7 months, and she walked her route with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to notice very little, which is a skill, I realized, not a personality trait. She had trained herself out of curiosity. I could see the shape of it. I started understanding that this was what the job did over time. It trained you through the rules and the repetition and the money to stop asking questions. And for most people, I think it worked. For me, it almost worked. The thing that broke it was the loading dock. I know I should have stayed away, I know the rule. I've asked myself 100 times why I walked toward the north dock at 2:15 in the morning on my 19th shift, and I think the honest answer is that the rules had never had a Y attached to them, and my brain had for weeks, and I was tired in that specific way night shift workers where your judgment gets thinner toward the end of the week. I walked to the north dock. The door was heavy and spring-loaded, and I opened it 3 inches and looked through. There was a truck backed up to the dock, a refrigerated truck, the kind you see making grocery deliveries, running quiet. 2 people in full protective gear, the kind that covers everything, gloves, sealed masks, were moving containers from the truck into the warehouse on a hand dolly. The containers were medical in design, heavy-grade white plastic with biohazard symbols and a second symbol I didn't recognize, a circle with a horizontal line through it, simple and deliberate. I had seen that symbol somewhere before, and it took me until the next morning to remember where, on a page of my grandfather's old medical encyclopedia, in a section about research ethics that had been written in the 1970s, in a paragraph about tissue preservation. That's what I'm going to call it. Tissue preservation. Because if I say what I think I was actually looking at, in plain language, I don't know how to get through the rest of what I need to say. I let the door close. I walked back to my section. I completed my route. I drove home at 6 in the morning and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex until 9, and then I went inside and I did not sleep. I went to Hargrove's office the next evening before my shift started, and I told him I was giving notice. He looked at me for a long moment, unhurried, the way he always was, and then he slid a piece of paper across the desk toward me. It was my employment contract, which I had signed in a hurry on my first day because I needed the money and didn't read closely enough. He pointed to a clause in Section 4, Paragraph 3. I won't reproduce the exact language, but the short version was this: early termination required 90 days written notice, and during those 90 days I was required to complete all scheduled shifts, and there was a penalty clause with a dollar figure that was almost exactly the amount I had earned so far. Leaving immediately, in other words, would cost me everything I'd made. He let me read it twice, and then he took it back and said, "Is there anything else?" I worked the 90 days. I walked my road and scanned my items and logged my discrepancies and heard sounds from Section 7 twice more and did not log them and did not speak of them. I watched 2 more people leave during that time. Stills first, and then a man named Ortega who had started 2 weeks after me. Greta was still there when I left. I think Greta will be there for a long time. On my last night, Priya walked me to the exit at the end of the shift. At the door, she stopped and looked at me and said, "Don't talk about this." Not an order. She said it like advice, like she was giving me something. I said I understood. She nodded and went back inside. That was 3 years ago. I work days now, a warehouse job for a company that makes nothing unusual and has no rules I can't explain. I sleep nights. The money is worse. I am fine with the money being worse. What I'm not fine with, what I haven't found a way to be fine with, is this: about 8 months after I left, I was at a doctor's appointment, a routine physical, nothing concerning. The doctor was going through my blood work results and paused and asked me if I'd had any recent occupational exposure to biological materials. I said no. She looked at something on her screen and then looked at me and said my results showed a marker she wasn't expecting, something she'd seen before in people who worked in certain research environments. She said it wasn't dangerous, not in any way she could currently measure. She said she'd like to monitor it going forward. She said, and I remember this precisely because I've turned it over in my mind many times, it's the kind of thing that doesn't affect you until it does. She said that 3 years ago I've had 4 more blood work panels since then. The marker is still there. It hasn't changed, which she says is a good sign, and I try to take it as a good sign. Some mornings I manage to. Some mornings I sit with my coffee and I think about the containers coming off the refrigerated truck, and the circle with the line through it. And I think about Priya saying, "Don't talk about this," in the tone of someone who understood exactly what I had seen and had made her own peace with it years before. And I think about Hargrove behind his desk, unhurried. And I think that somewhere in a warehouse at the edge of a city, a woman named Greta is walking her route right now, head down, scanner in hand, logging nothing that doesn't belong on the log. And I think that I am never going to know exactly what those 90 days put in my blood. And I think that not knowing might be the thing I carry longest. Story 6. I took the job because the money was right and because I wanted to be alone for a while, which I know sounds like the beginning of a joke. My name is Sarah Coldwind, and at the time I was 32 and freshly out of a 4-year relationship that had ended badly enough that my apartment felt like a place where something had happened, the way a room feels after an argument even after everyone has left. The job was a remote weather monitoring position, a private research contract, not government, run by a company called Vantage Climate Group, whose website was functional but sparse. The work involved staying at a monitoring station in northern Montana for 60 days, checking instruments twice daily, logging readings, maintaining equipment, and transmitting data on a fixed schedule. No special qualifications required beyond basic technical literacy and what the contract called an ability to remain productive in isolated conditions. I had a biology degree I wasn't using and a need to be somewhere that wasn't my apartment. I signed the contract in an afternoon. The station was a prefabricated structure about the size of a large studio apartment, set into a hillside so that only the front face and the instrument deck were fully exposed to weather. It had insulation that actually worked, a diesel generator, a month's worth of food in dry and canned storage, a satellite phone for emergencies, and a narrowband radio transmitter for the twice daily data sends. There was no internet, there was no cell service. There was a small shelf of paperback books that previous occupants had left behind, none of which I would have chosen for myself, and a wall calendar from 2 years prior that someone had forgotten, still showing October as though time had stopped there. I flipped it to the right month when I arrived and wrote my start date in the box. Day 1. I am a person who tracks things. I had brought my own journal, a thick one, green cover, and a good watch, a Seiko that had been my father's, reliable and simple, and I intended to log everything with the same care I brought to the instrument readings. The first 2 weeks were genuinely fine. I want to say that clearly because the story loses something if I skip the part where it was fine. The routine settled into my body the way routines do when there's nothing to interrupt them. 6 a.m. instrument check, log readings, transmit, noon secondary check log, evening personal log in the green journal, read for an hour, sleep. The land around the station was flat in every direction for about 2 miles before it rose into low hills, and in the early morning the light came across it in a way that was so even and complete that it looked painted. I ran a loop around the station perimeter most mornings, about 1.5 miles, and I felt my body adjusting to the cold and the altitude and the silence. The silence was the thing I had been most uncertain about before I arrived, and it turned out to be the thing I valued most. It wasn't empty silence, it had texture to it, wind and the occasional sound of the equipment, and sometimes at night the calls of animals I couldn't identify. But underneath all of that was a quiet so deep it felt like rest. I noticed the first thing on day 19. I had been keeping my journal on the small table next to my cot, always in the same position, spine facing me, cover up, because I wrote in it last thing before sleeping and first thing after waking, and I had a specific way of placing it. On the morning of day 19 I woke and the journal was on the table with the spine facing away. I picked it up and opened it and checked my last entry, which I had written the night before, and it was there, normal, nothing missing. I turned the journal back to my preferred position and thought nothing further about it. I'm a restless sleeper. I could have knocked it in the night and not remembered. I logged the instrument readings and ran my loop and moved on. The watch started on day 23. My father's Seiko had kept perfect time for the 11 years I'd owned it, and I had set it to the correct time when I arrived and verified it against the station's clock on day 1. On the morning of day 23 it was running 11 minutes slow. I reset it against the station clock, which I trusted because it ran on battery and calibrated automatically via the radio signal from the transmitter. The next morning the Seiko was slow again by a different amount. 9 minutes, I reset it. The morning after that it was fast. 7 minutes ahead. I set it on the table and looked at it and tried to remember if I had dropped it, hit it on something, done anything that might have affected the movement. I hadn't. I continued resetting it daily, logging the variance in my journal out of habit, telling myself it was a mechanical problem, telling myself watches failed, telling myself this was a 40-year-old watch and some drift was normal. The variances I noticed after a week of logging them had no pattern. 11 slow, 9 slow, 7 fast, 4 slow, 13 fast, random. Watches don't run randomly slow and fast. They have consistent errors, consistent directions of drift. This was something else, and I logged it and set it aside and did not let myself think too much about what else it might mean. Day 31 I found my logbook, the official instrument log, not my personal journal, open on the desk when I returned from my evening perimeter check. I always closed it. I had a specific habit of closing it and placing the pen on top of it. It was open to a page from 4 days prior and the pen was on the floor. I picked up the pen and closed the logbook and stood in the middle of the station and listened. The generator, the wind against the north wall, nothing else. I checked the door. It had been locked, was still locked. I checked the windows, all sealed. I checked the storage area in the back. Nothing. Nobody. I wrote in my green journal that night, "Something is moving things." I wrote it plainly and then I read it back and I wrote underneath it, "Or I am moving things and not remembering." I was not sure which of those was worse. The mental doubt phase, I call it that now looking back because it had a shape to it, a progression, lasted from about day 30 to day 45, and it was the most frightening part, not because of what was happening, but because of what I couldn't verify. I started rereading my journal entries from the beginning and finding small things that didn't match my memory. Not dramatic inconsistencies, small ones. An entry on day 12 that said I had eaten the last of the crackers when I was sure, completely sure, I had saved a sleeve. An entry on day 17 that described a clear night sky, when I remembered clearly that day 17 had been overcast and I'd thought about the cloud cover in relation to the instrument readings. I read these entries and I sat with the discomfort of not being able to trust the page that was in my own handwriting or the memory that felt solid in my body, and I could not find a way to hold both of them as true simultaneously. I started leaving markers. This is something I'm not sure I've told anyone. I started placing objects in specific positions before I left the station for my instrument checks and perimeter runs. The journal at a specific angle, a mug handle pointing in a specific direction. My father's watch face down on the left side of the table rather than the right. And when I came back, I checked them. For 5 days, everything was where I left it, and I started to believe that the earlier disturbances had been me tired and adjusting, and that the isolation had been making me sloppy and forgetful in ways I couldn't perceive from inside. On day 46, I came back from my morning instrument check to find every marker I had placed moved. Not dramatically, small movements each one. The journal shifted 6 inches, the mug handle pointing 90 degrees from where I'd left it, the watch on the right side of the table instead of the left. Every single one. I had been gone 30 minutes. I sat down on the floor of the station and I stayed there for a long time. I want to describe what I felt, because I think people imagine fear as a loud thing, a sudden thing, and this wasn't that. This was something quieter and more thorough. This was the feeling of understanding that something had been in the room while I was outside, and that it had not hidden or left a note or revealed itself in any way. It had moved the mug and the watch and the journal precisely, carefully, and that was all. Which meant it knew about the markers. It had watched me place them. It understood what I was doing, and it had answered me, and the answer was yes, I am here, and yes, I have been here, and I can do this as long as I need to. I radioed for early extraction that evening. The Vantage climate protocol for early extraction involved a 3-day wait for weather and logistics, and I spent those 3 days in the station doing my checks and logging my readings and watching my markers and saying nothing in the logbook about any of it, just keeping my personal journal under my shirt at all times because it was the only thing I trusted to be where I put it. Nothing moved after day 46. Nothing moved in those final 3 days, as if whatever had answered me had made its point and was now waiting patient for whatever came next. The extraction team was 2 people in a truck who drove me 6 hours south to the nearest city. They didn't ask questions beyond the standard protocol ones. Was I physically well? Had the equipment been maintained? Was there anything requiring immediate attention at the site? I said yes, and no. I got a hotel room and I slept for 14 hours, and when I woke up I felt, briefly, like myself again. The specific relief of walls that didn't shift while you slept. I submitted my final report to Vantage Climate Group. They processed my pay and sent a form thank you email. When I tried to find the company online a few months later, the website was gone. Not down, just gone. Like it had been cleaned off the internet. The email address in my contract bounced. I filed that away with the other things I couldn't resolve. For the first month back in my apartment, I was fine. Better than fine. Actually, the city felt warm and human and full of the right kind of noise. I unpacked my bag. I put my green journal on the shelf. I put my father's watch on the nightstand. Then, on an ordinary morning about 5 weeks after I got back, I woke up and the journal was on the wrong side of the shelf, 2 inches to the left of where I keep it. I stood in front of the shelf for a long time in the early morning light. I picked up the journal. I opened it to the last entry, the one I'd written the night before, and the pen I use, a blue rollerball I keep inside the journal's back cover, was gone, not lost. Gone the way things go when something has been through your belongings and taken only one specific item, and left everything else where it can be found, to make sure that you know the difference. My father's watch was running 13 minutes fast. I haven't reset it. I haven't moved the journal back 2 inches to the right. I don't know why. I think I'm afraid that if I do, something will move it again, and I'll be back on day 46, sitting on the floor of the station, understanding that it already knows what I'm going to do before I do it. I think some part of me has decided that leaving things where they are is the only control I have left, and I am holding onto that with both hands, in my apartment in the city, surrounded by all the right noises, telling myself each morning that this is manageable, that there is a line between there and here, that the 60 days ended when the truck drove me south. My journal says something different. My journal, which I wrote in and closed and placed on the right side of the shelf, says something different, and I am running out of ways to argue with it. Story 7. I need to say first that I am not the kind of person who believes in cover-ups. I was raised by a man who worked 30 years for the county water department and trusted institutions the way some people trust weather. Not blindly, but practically, because they were there and they functioned and the alternative was chaos. I have voted in every election I was eligible for. I have filed my taxes correctly every year. I am Miriam Walking Cloud and I am 41 years old, and I am telling you this because I need you to understand who I was before any of this happened. Because I think it matters that the person this happened to was not looking for it, was not the type, was not someone who had any reason to see what she saw or any framework for understanding it once she did. What I saw happened on a Tuesday evening in late September, on a rural highway about 12 miles outside of a small town in eastern Montana where I had lived my whole life. I was driving home from my sister's house, a drive I had made hundreds of times, on a road I knew well enough to drive in the dark. It was just past 8 and still just barely light, that specific gray-blue of late September evenings, and I came around the long bend before the Calvert Creek Bridge and saw the vehicles on the shoulder. 3 of them, 2 black SUVs and a white panel van, no markings on any of them, parked in a line facing the same direction, engines off. There were figures in the field beside the road, maybe 6 or 7 of them, moving with flashlights, in a rough grid pattern like they were searching something or marking something. They were wearing what I first took to be dark work gear, but as I slowed down, I slowed without deciding to, the way you do when something registers as wrong before your brain has processed it. I saw that the gear was more than that, full coverage. The kind of gear that's sealed at the wrists and ankles. 2 of the figures near the van were carrying something between them in a heavy-duty bag, the long kind, and moving with the specific careful effort of people carrying significant weight. I stopped on the shoulder about 50 yards past the vehicles. I don't know why I stopped. I had my phone in the cuff holder and I picked it up and took 4 photographs through the driver's side window. The vehicles, the figures, the van with its rear doors open. The light was poor and I was 50 yards away and I knew the photos might not show much, but I took them because something in me said to take them. The same instinct that makes you grab a journal or a logbook when you're running out of a burning building. Then a figure near the van turned and looked directly at my car, and I put the car in drive and left. The police arrived at my house at 9:40 that same evening. Not 1 officer, 2 patrol cars, and a vehicle I didn't recognize, a dark sedan with county plates. 3 uniformed officers and a man in plain clothes who showed me a badge so briefly I caught only that it was federal and had a seal I didn't recognize. His name, he said, was Rourke. He had the particular quality of stillness that I have since come to associate with people who have been trained to appear calm in order to make other people feel irrational by comparison. He was polite and thorough, and everything he said was slightly wrong in a way I couldn't immediately locate. He said there had been a report of a vehicle stopping near an active emergency response site on Route 9. He said I matched the description of the vehicle. He asked if I had been on Route 9 that evening, and I said yes, and he nodded like I had confirmed something. He asked if I had stopped. I said yes briefly. He asked why. I said because I saw vehicles pulled over and people in the field, and it looked unusual. He said he understood and that the situation had involved a private environmental remediation operation, that there had been a chemical spill reported earlier that day, and the crew I'd seen were contractors handling the cleanup. He said this calmly and completely, with the specific completeness of someone reciting something they have said before. I asked why the vehicles had no markings. He said private contractors weren't required to mark vehicles for transport operations. I asked what had been in the bag the 2 figures were carrying. He paused, the first pause he had taken, and then said he wasn't able to speak to specific equipment used during remediation operations, but that everything on site had been handled according to protocol. He asked if I had taken any photographs. I said no. I don't know why I said no. I said it before I decided to say it. The way you flinch before you know you're going to. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that was pleasant and empty, and said he appreciated my cooperation and handed me a card with a number to call if I had any further questions, and then he and the 3 officers left, and I stood in my doorway and watched the sedan back out of my driveway, and I felt for the first time the specific cold that comes not from fear but from understanding that something has just been managed. I looked at the photographs on my phone. They were there that night. All 4 of them blurry, low light, but the vehicles visible and the figures visible and the van's open rear doors clear enough. I sent them to my own email before I went to bed. When I checked my email in the morning, they hadn't arrived. I checked my sent folder, they were there, sent timestamp, delivered according to the log. I checked my inbox, my spam folder, every folder. Nothing. I checked my phone. The photos were gone. Not in the deleted folder. Gone the way files go when something removes them from the root rather than the surface. I went to the sheriff's office the following morning and asked to file a report about what I'd seen. The deputy at the desk, a man I recognized, Tanner Bliss, who had gone to school with my brother, took my name and the details and typed something into the computer and said he'd make sure it was logged. I asked for a copy of the report number. He gave me a slip of paper with a number on it. When I called back 3 days later and gave that number, the woman who answered said it didn't correspond to any active report in the system. I want to be careful here about the difference between what I know and what I suspect, because I've spent a long time being careful about that distinction and I think it's important. What I know, the report number was invalid. What I know, my photos disappeared between the night I took them and the morning after. What I know, a federal officer came to my home within 90 minutes of the incident, which on a rural highway 12 miles outside a small town means he was either already nearby or was notified and responded with a speed that requires explanation. What I suspected and began to investigate was whether this had happened before. I spent 3 weeks in the county archive, which is housed in a room in the basement of the courthouse that smells like old paper and inadequate ventilation and which is staffed by a single part-time archivist named Dolores who left me alone with the stacks as long as I signed the access log. I was looking for incident reports, environmental filings, any documented activity along the Route 9 corridor in the past 20 years. What I found took me the better part of those 3 weeks to piece together because the relevant materials were not absent. They were diluted, filed under different categories, cross-referenced in ways that made them hard to connect, some in paper files that hadn't been digitized and sat in boxes that had not been signed out. According to the access log, in over a decade, I found 4 prior incidents along the same stretch of Route 9, each separated by 2 to 4 years, each documented minimally. A brief initial report, and then a follow-up notation that said, in identical language across all 4, case reviewed and closed per coordinating agency directive, no agency name, no directive number. The same language word for word in documents spanning 14 years, which meant someone had a template and had been using it. I was copying notes from the 3rd incident file when Dolores came back to the stacks and told me I had a visitor. The man waiting for me in the archive's small front room was not Rourke. He was older, heavier, with the look of someone who had been doing a specific kind of work for a long time and had stopped finding it interesting. He didn't show me a badge. He sat down across from the small table and waited for me to sit, and when I did, he said, in a voice that was quiet and entirely without menace, which was somehow worse than menace would have been, Miss Walking Cloud, I think you're a person who understands when something isn't good for her. I want to believe that about you. I'd like to continue believing it. I asked him who he was. He said that wasn't relevant. I asked him who he worked for. He said that wasn't relevant either. He said what was relevant was that I had been spending time in county archives looking at materials that touched on operations I wasn't cleared for, and that this had been noticed, and that the people who had noticed it were patient people but not infinitely patient people, and that I had a sister who lived 12 miles outside of town on Route 9. Which he said the way you say something you've chosen to say, deliberately, with full awareness of what you're putting in the air between 2 people. I drove home and I sat in my kitchen and I did not go back to the archive. What followed was a particular kind of ordinary that felt like a costume. I went to work, I managed the front office for a veterinary practice, and I came home and I cooked meals and I called my sister and I functioned. But I began to notice things that I might not have noticed before, or might have noticed and dismissed. The car that sat on my street for 3 days and then was gone and then came back. The fact that my work email began running slow in a specific way, the way email runs slow when there is additional processing happening somewhere in the chain. The phone calls that connected a beat too late, a half-second delay that wasn't there before. The man I didn't recognize who ate lunch at the diner across from my office 3 times in 2 weeks and looked at his phone whenever I looked at him. I tried once to contact a journalist. I found a reporter at a state paper who had written about environmental violations and I composed an email carefully, no specifics, just asking if she covered stories involving undocumented activity on rural corridors. The email bounced. I tried her paper's general tip line. The form submitted and I received a confirmation number and never heard back. I tried a second reporter at a different outlet. Same result. I am not a paranoid person. I know what I am describing sounds like paranoia. I am describing what happened. 6 months after the night on Route 9, I received a letter. Official envelope, county seal, the kind of letter that looks like a tax notice or a jury summons. Inside was a single sheet with the county letterhead at the top and 3 paragraphs of language so procedural it took me 2 readings to understand what it was saying. The summary was this: a review had been conducted of all documentation related to an environmental response operation on Route 9 in September, and the review had determined that all applicable protocols had been followed, all materials had been properly handled and disposed of, and there were no outstanding concerns related to public safety or regulatory compliance. It said the matter was considered closed. It thanked me for my patience during the review process. I had never filed a formal complaint. I had never submitted anything to the county in writing. I had given my name to Tanner Bliss at the sheriff's desk and that report had never existed. The letter is in a fireproof box under my bed, along with the notes I copied from the archive before I stopped going. I show it to no one. I don't discuss this in any digital format that I can connect to my name. I type this out on a laptop I bought for cash and I will destroy the file when I'm done. My sister still lives on Route 9. I drive out to see her twice a month. I have not told her what I saw near the Calvert Creek Bridge. I take a different route and I don't slow down for anything on the shoulder, and I keep my phone in my bag, not the cup holder, because I know now that taking it out is a decision with consequences, and I know now that the people who arrived at my house 90 minutes after I pulled over on a dark rural highway are still patient, and still watching, and still very much not done with whatever they were doing in that field. The case has been closed. The case has been closed and it is not over, and those two things are both true, and I am the only person I know who understands how. Story 8. I found Raymond Sozi through a legitimate outfitter company. I want to be clear about that because when I tell this story, people sometimes assume I found him through some obscure listing or a handwritten flyer on a corkboard somewhere, and the truth is more uncomfortable than that. He was listed on the website of a company called Red Rock Wilderness Guides based out of Flagstaff, with a professional headshot and a bio that listed 15 years of experience leading groups through canyon country in Arizona and Utah, certifications in wilderness first aid and high-angle rescue, and a sentence at the bottom that said he had grown up on Navajo land and brought both traditional knowledge and modern safety training to every expedition. He had 14 reviews and they were all good. I read every one of them. The words that came up most often were trustworthy, knowledgeable, calm under pressure. One reviewer called him the best guide I've ever hired, and I've hired a lot of guides. I booked him for a 6-day canyon expedition for 4 people, myself and 3 friends, and I paid the deposit with my credit card and received a confirmation email and a detailed packing list within 24 hours. Everything about it was professional. Everything about it was exactly what it was supposed to be. There were 4 of us, me, a woman named Cora Six Killer who was my closest friend and had done trips like this before, a man named Paul who worked with Cora and was new to this kind of hiking, and Paul's wife Denise who was the most experienced of all of us in the backcountry and had the gear to prove it. We met Raymond at the trailhead at 6 in the morning on a Monday in early October. He was shorter than his photo suggested, compact and unhurried, with a canvas pack that looked like it had been everywhere, and a topographic map in a clear plastic sleeve that he pulled out immediately and spread across the hood of his truck to show us the route. He had a handheld radio clipped to his pack strap, the kind that worked on NOAA weather frequencies as well as standard channels, and a flashlight on his hip and a first aid kit in a red nylon pouch strapped to the outside of his pack. He went through our equipment checks without making anyone feel incompetent, which is a skill. He told us the rules for the trip: stay within visual range on open terrain, announce all breaks, no earbuds on the trail because you needed to hear the terrain, and the one he said with the most emphasis, if he said stop, we stopped immediately without asking why. Because in canyon country the reason to stop was often something you couldn't see yet. He said this last rule with a smile that made it feel like sensible practice rather than a command. The first 2 days were genuinely wonderful. The canyon country in early October has a quality of light I have no adequate words for. The walls are red and orange, and in the morning the shadows are long and blue, and the contrast between them is almost violent. Raymond knew the terrain the way you know the inside of a house you grew up in, moving through it without consulting the map except to show us things, pointing out water sources and geological features, and twice, petroglyphs on sheltered rock faces that we would never have found alone. He told us the names the Dine used for certain formations, which were different from the names on the maps and in most cases more accurate to what the formations actually looked like. Paul was keeping a small notebook and writing things down, which Raymond seemed to appreciate. Denise asked technical questions about route, finding, and Raymond answered them fully, without the slight condescension some guides gave to women who asked technical questions. Cora told me at camp that second night that she already trusted him completely. I said I did too, I meant it. The first deviation was small and I didn't register it as a deviation at the time. On the morning of the 3rd day, Raymond changed the route. Not dramatically. He showed us on the map, pointed to a tributary canyon that branched off our planned path, and said the main route had some unstable ground following recent rain, and he wanted to take us around it. The tributary added about 2 miles but was, he said, worth seeing for its own reasons. We agreed without discussing it. He was the guide. We had agreed implicitly to follow his judgment. I noted it in my personal log. I kept a small journal on the trip, recording distances and waypoints and observations the way I always do on backcountry trips. I noted the route change and the stated reason and moved on. The tributary canyon was narrower than the main route and the walls were higher, which meant less direct light and a different quality of quiet. Not bad quiet, just closer. We made camp that night in a wide spot where the canyon floor leveled out, a good campsite, sheltered and flat. But at dinner Raymond was quieter than he'd been, and once when Paul asked him a question about the next day's route, he paused before answering in a way that felt like he was deciding something rather than remembering something. Small, easy to dismiss. I didn't dismiss it, but I set it aside. On the 4th morning I woke before the others, which I often do, and I saw Raymond sitting apart from the camp with the topographic map open on his knees. This was not unusual. Guides check maps in the morning. What was unusual was the way he was sitting perfectly still, looking not at the map but at the canyon wall to the north. and the way he was sitting felt like waiting rather than resting, like he was waiting for something he expected. I lay still in my sleeping bag and watched him for several minutes, and then he looked down at the map, and I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, he was up and moving around the camp, and starting the camp stove, and everything was normal. He knew about Cora's sister. That was the moment of real doubt, and I want to describe it exactly. We were walking a narrow section of trail in the early afternoon, and Raymond was just ahead of me and Cora was just behind, and he said something about the canyon being a place that held family stories, that certain formations in Dine tradition were connected to specific clan histories, and then he said, without turning around, that he imagined Cora understood something about that, about carrying a family story that was hard to put down. Cora went quiet for a moment and then said yes, she supposed she did. I looked back at her face, and it was careful in a way that meant something had been touched. That evening I asked her what he had meant, and she said her younger sister had disappeared 3 years ago, a missing persons case that was still open, and she had never found out what happened. She said she hadn't told Raymond that. She said she was sure she hadn't told him. I checked my journal that night for any entry where I might have mentioned Cora's sister, any conversation in Raymond's presence where it might have come up. Nothing. I went back through every day. Nothing. The radio incident happened on the 5th morning. We were breaking camp and Raymond had his radio out and was checking the weather channel, which he did every morning, and I was close enough to hear it when a voice came through on a different frequency. Not weather, a different channel entirely, one he had apparently switched to without announcing it. The voice was brief, just a few words, and Raymond turned the radio down immediately and looked up and saw me watching and gave me a completely normal smile and said, "Good weather window for today." The voice I'd heard was not a weather broadcast. It was a person's voice, one word that I caught clearly and one I wasn't sure of. The word I caught clearly was a direction north. The word I wasn't sure of sounded like a name, but not a name I knew, and not Raymond's name, which meant someone had used a different name for him on a radio frequency that was not the weather channel. On the 5th day of a trip that had already deviated from the planned route once, I told Cora that night while Raymond and Paul and Denise were hanging food bags. I told her about the radio and about her sister and about the morning I'd seen him watching the canyon wall. She was quiet through all of it, the specific quiet of someone running calculations, and then she said, "We need to finish the trip tomorrow instead of the day after. The exit was reachable in a long day if we pushed." I said we'd have to tell Raymond. She said we'd tell him we had a reason to get back early, something at home, and we'd watch his face when we said it. We told him at breakfast. Paul and Denise were present. I watched Raymond's face the way Cora had suggested, and what I saw was almost nothing. Almost nothing, which is not the same as nothing. A stillness that lasted about 1 second before the normal response came. He said he understood that it was our trip to make, that the exit was doable in a long day if we kept pace. He folded the map and put it in his pack. He was helpful and efficient for the entire day's walk. He got us to the trailhead at 6 in the evening, shook hands with each of us, helped load gear into the car, told us it had been a good group. I watched him in the rearview mirror as we pulled out. He was standing by his truck, not moving, not going to his door or his phone, just standing watching us go, and he was still standing in the same position when we rounded the curve and lost sight of him. We filed nothing. I know how that sounds. We had nothing concrete to file. A route deviation, a radio we didn't fully hear, a comment he'd made that Cora couldn't prove, she hadn't mentioned herself in some conversation she'd forgotten. I've told myself these things many times. I've told myself we had no evidence of anything beyond a feeling, which is true, and I've told myself that feelings are sometimes the only warning you get, which is also true. 6 months later, I was looking for a different trip, different area, and I was browsing an outfitter's site. Not Red Rock, a different company operating out of New Mexico. I found a guide bio with a professional headshot, different name. The bio was different in its specifics, different years of experience, different certifications listed, a different personal detail about regional background. But the face was Raymond Sosie's face. The same careful, pleasant expression from the professional headshot, just a different name underneath it. I sat looking at that page for a long time. Then I took a screenshot and texted it to Cora. She replied in under a minute. It was a single word. She said north. The direction from the radio. The word I'd been sure of. She had heard it too and hadn't told me until I sent her that photo, and now I understood why. Because hearing it again meant the trip wasn't over. Because wherever Raymond Sosie was operating under a new name in the canyons of New Mexico, the frequency he'd been broadcasting on was still active, and someone on the other end was still listening, and the route they were planning did not end at any trailhead on any map I had ever seen. Story 9. The first time my grandmother showed me how to do the morning round, I was 7 years old and it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. That's the part I keep coming back to years later, sitting with everything I now know, how natural it seemed. How ordinary. She woke me before sunrise, which she did every morning regardless, and she took me to the kitchen and showed me the shelf above the stove where she kept 7 small clay bowls, each one the size of a fist, each one a slightly different color from the others. Brown, gray, red, a dull yellow, a near black one that was almost white. and one that had no color I could name, a color that changed depending on how the light hit it. She filled each bowl from a different container in a specific order, always the same order, and the things she put in them were ordinary things. Solder in the second, a pinch of dried corn in the third, a drop of oil in the fourth, ash from the previous night's fire in the fifth, a small dried berry in the sixth. The seventh bowl she left empty. She moved from left to right, never right to left, and she said the same phrase at each bowl in a low voice that wasn't quite speaking and wasn't quite singing. I didn't know the language then. I learned it later, and I will come back to what it meant. After she filled the bowls, she carried the shelf, the whole shelf. It was hinged at the back and lifted free from its brackets, out to the back step, and she set it down facing east, toward the first gray light, and she stood behind it with her eyes closed for exactly the length of time it took her to breathe in and out 7 times. Then she brought the shelf back inside, emptied the bowls into a clay pot she kept under the sink, and started making breakfast like nothing had happened. She called it the morning round. She said her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that. She said it was a way of keeping the house in good standing, which was a phrase she used often, good standing, and which I understood at 7 to mean something like being polite to the place you lived in. I thought of it like setting the table, a preparation, a courtesy. When I was old enough to do the round myself, she stood beside me the first few times and corrected my hands when I poured in the wrong order and repeated the phrase with me until I had it, and then she let me do it alone. By the time I was 12, I could do the morning round in 8 minutes without thinking about it. I did it every day I was at her house. I did it in the particular not thinking way that you do things that have always been true. My grandmother's name was Celeste Manikids, and she lived until she was 83, and she never missed a morning round in my memory, not once. Not when she was sick, not when there was ice on the back step, not when she had company sleeping in every room. The round happened before everything else. Before coffee, before conversation, before any other business of the day. When I asked her once what happened if she missed it, she looked at me with an expression I didn't have words for at the time and said, "We don't miss it. Not we won't or we can't. We don't." Like it was a category of thing that didn't happen. Like asking what would happen if gravity stopped. I moved away for college when I was 18, and I kept doing the round in my dorm room, which was awkward given the equipment, and I modified it. I didn't have a shelf, I used a windowsill. And I didn't always have ash, so I used pencil dust from sharpening a pencil, which I told myself was close enough. I didn't examine why I kept doing it. It was habit the way breathing was habit. It would have felt stranger to stop than to continue. My roommate asked me once what I was doing, and I said it was a family thing, a morning tradition, and she nodded and didn't ask more, which was the right response. Some things explain themselves by their consistency. The first sign that something was wrong with my understanding of the round came when I was 24, 6 years out of college, living in a small city, working a desk job, doing the round every morning on the kitchen windowsill of my apartment. I had started keeping a journal around that time, not for any specific reason, just because I had thoughts I wanted to track. And one morning I noticed I'd written the date before describing the round, and something about the date nagged at me. It was the 21st of March, the spring equinox. I opened my phone and checked the date against a list I'd been building without quite realizing I was building it. I had been noting, for a few months, the dates when the round felt different. When the phrase I said over each bowl seemed to sit differently in my mouth. When the not-colored bowl seemed to shift more obviously in the light. When the empty 7th bowl seemed at the edge of my vision. Not empty, I had 8 dates noted. I checked them against a calendar of astronomical and seasonal events. All 8 of them corresponded exactly to a solstice and equinox, or a cross-quarter day, the 8 traditional divisions of the solar year. I sat with my coffee and I looked at the list for a long time. I called my mother. I asked her if she knew what the phrase meant, the one said over each bowl. She knew the phrase. She had grown up with it the same as me. But she said she'd never known what it meant exactly, that it was old language, that my grandmother had told her it was a greeting of some kind, a daily greeting. I said I thought I'd found a translation. I had found it in an ethnobotanical text I'd come across while researching something else, a text that referenced a specific ceremonial language used in a handful of communities in the northern plains, and the phrase had been documented there in a slightly different form but recognizable enough that I was confident. My mother asked me what it meant. I read it to her. It meant, "I am here and I am feeding you, and I ask that you remain steady." My mother was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, that sounds like a greeting to me." I said it didn't sound like a greeting to me. I said a greeting didn't include the word feeding. I said I had been filling those bowls every morning for 17 years, and I had never asked what I was feeding, and I thought maybe I should have asked sooner. My mother said I was overcomplicating something simple. We ended the call politely. I sat at my kitchen window and looked at the 7 bowls on the sill, and I thought about the 7th one, the empty one. The one my grandmother had always left empty without explanation, and I thought about what you leave empty when the other 6 are full, and what that emptiness might mean to something that was being fed. I stopped the round the following morning. I want to describe those 3 days carefully because I think the description matters. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. I went to work on the first day and came home, and the apartment was as I'd left it. I slept normally. I told myself it had been a habit and habits could be broken, and nothing was going to happen because I hadn't put salt in a clay bowl before sunrise. On the second day, I woke at 4 in the morning for no reason I could identify, and lay in the dark with a feeling I can only describe as pressure. Not physical pressure, but the feeling of something that is usually present being absent. The way a sound you've tuned out becomes noticeable only when it stops, except in reverse. The absence of the round was present in the apartment in a way that the round itself had never been. On the third day, I found the seventh bowl. The empty one had moved from the windowsill to the kitchen table. I had not moved it. I lived alone. I put it back on the sill. I stood there looking at all 7 bowls, and I made a decision that I am not proud of, but that I believe was correct given what I now know. I did the round. I filled all 6 bowls in order. I said the phrase at each one. I carried the shelf to face the east light. I breathed 7 times. I brought it back. The pressure in the apartment eased within an hour, gradually, like a room airing out. I have thought many times about what I was feeding and whether I was right to keep feeding it. My grandmother's phrase said, "I ask that you remain steady," which implies that steadiness was the alternative to something else, which implies that whatever received the bowl's contents every morning was capable of being unsteady, and that the round was the thing that kept it from that. I have thought about the 7th bowl, always empty, and whether the emptiness was an offering or a space being held open, and for what. I did the round every morning for 6 more years. I did it the way my grandmother did it, without missing, without shortening, without asking questions I wasn't going to like the answers to. Then my job relocated me to a different city, and in the confusion of moving, I missed 3 consecutive mornings. The third morning, I woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of the phrase being spoken in my new apartment. I was alone. I am certain I was alone. It was my grandmother's voice, the low sound that was between speaking and singing, and it said the phrase once through all 7 repetitions and then was quiet. I got up and did the round. I did it without turning on the lights in the gray pre-dawn, my hands finding the bowls by feel the way they had for 20 years. I still do it. I will do it tomorrow. I have accepted this. But last month I was in an unfamiliar neighborhood in a city I was visiting for work, walking to my hotel early in the morning, and I passed an apartment building with ground floor windows that faced the street. In one of those windows, a woman I had never seen before was standing at her kitchen windowsill with 7 small bowls in front of her, moving left to right, filling each one in order. Her lips were moving. I stopped on the sidewalk and I watched, and I knew, before I could hear anything through the glass, exactly what her lips were shaping. I knew the phrase the way I knew my own name. She did not look up. She filled all 6 bowls and left the 7th empty and stood facing east for 7 breaths. I walked to my hotel. I sat on the edge of the bed. I thought about my grandmother saying we don't miss it, and I thought about what has to be true about a thing for it to be passed to strangers in cities you've never visited, practiced in windows in the gray early morning by people who learned it from their own grandmothers who learned it from theirs. All of us saying the same phrase over the same bowls, all of us feeding the same thing. I thought about how many windows there might be, in how many cities facing east in the early morning, with 7 bowls on the sill and a 7th bowl always empty. I thought about what requires that much feeding, every morning without fail across that many years and that many people. I thought about what it would do if we stopped. I think about the 7th bowl. I think about the empty one. I think about what steady looks like compared to its opposite. And every morning, before coffee, before anything, I fill 6 bowls and I leave one empty, and I say the phrase and I carry the shelf to face the light, and I breathe 7 times and I bring it back inside, and I don't miss it, and I don't ask what I'm feeding anymore, because I've decided that the answer to that question is one of the things the 7th bowl is holding. Empty, for now. Story 10. My husband Thomas and I had been married for 9 years when I first noticed something was wrong. And the hardest part of telling this story is that I can't point to a single moment and say that was it. That was when it started, because it didn't start with a single moment. It started the way fog comes in, gradually, at the edges, in a way that your eyes adjust to without your brain registering the adjustment, so that by the time you understand you can't see clearly, you've already been standing in the fog for a long time. Thomas Littlesky was a quiet man, which I say not as a complaint but as a fact, the way I color is a fact. He had been quiet since I met him at 26, a contained and specific quietness that expressed itself in particular ways. He listened more than he spoke in groups. He thought before answering even simple questions. He showed affection through proximity rather than words, sitting close, a hand on the back, the specific gravity of a person who communicates in presence. We had built a life around this. I am loud where he was quiet, quick where he was slow, and we had fit together for 9 years in the way of 2 people who have learned each other's shapes. I knew his shapes completely. That is not an exaggeration. I knew the way he held a coffee cup with both hands even in summer. I knew that he couldn't sleep on his left side, and always started on his right and rolled to his back by morning. I knew that he bit the inside of his cheek when he was thinking hard, that he was incapable of leaving a book face down and always used a receipt or a bus transfer as a bookmark. that he signed his name with a loop on the T that was unique enough that I had teased him about it once and he'd laughed and said it was from learning cursive left, handed before a teacher switched him. A story I'd heard 3 times and could have told myself. The loop disappeared from his signature in March of last year. I noticed it on a birthday card he signed for my mother, and I looked at it for a moment and thought nothing specific. Just a vague not rightness that I set aside the way you set aside a word that sounds suddenly strange after you've said it too many times. I did not say anything. I filed it in the back of my mind in the drawer where I put things I wasn't ready to look at. In April, he started sleeping on his left side. I lay next to him the first night and watched him settle onto his left side and stay there, and I felt something move through me that I still don't have a word for. Not alarm. More like the feeling of a picture slightly crooked on a wall. Something that creates a low-level wrongness that you can't stop seeing once you've seen it. I told myself people change their sleeping positions. Bodies changed. Things shifted. I rolled over and closed my eyes and told myself this. The coffee cup changed in May. He started holding it by the handle only one hand, the way most people hold cups. I watched him do it 3 mornings in a row before I said something. Carefully, lightly, I said, "You're holding your cup differently." He looked at the cup and then at me with an expression of mild confusion and said he didn't know what I meant, and went back to reading the news on his phone. His expression was Thomas's expression. His voice was Thomas's voice. I poured my own coffee and said nothing more. I want to be honest about the gaslighting because I think it's the most important part, and the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been inside it. When I say gaslighting, I don't mean Thomas was doing it deliberately. Or rather, I don't know what I mean when I say that, because I no longer know what was deliberate and what was something else. What I mean is that every time I tried to surface one of these things to another person, the shape of the conversation made me feel like the problem was my noticing rather than the thing I'd noticed. I called my friend Renata in May and mentioned the sleeping position and the cup and the signature, and she said, with genuine kindness, that I sounded stressed, that 9 years was a long time and it was natural to start seeing things, that Thomas seemed fine to her, that he'd seemed perfectly normal at dinner 2 weeks ago. My sister said something similar. My mother, who loved Thomas, said I should think about whether I was looking for problems because things had been good for too long and some part of me didn't trust the good. I am a person who takes feedback seriously. I took this feedback seriously. I told myself they were right and I was tired and I should let it go. But I kept the drawer in my mind, and I kept putting things in it. June. He finished a book and left it face down on the nightstand. I looked at it for a long time. I picked it up and found a receipt inside it tucked in at about the halfway point, like he'd used it as a bookmark and then abandoned it, which meant he had started to use a bookmark and then stopped. I stood in the bedroom holding the face-down book and the receipt inside it, and I understood that whatever was wrong had a specific quality to it. It knew the shape. It knew the bookmark habit, had started to perform it, and had let it lapse. Like something that had learned a detail and was losing track of it. Like something that had been thorough at first and was becoming less careful. I started going through his things in July. I am not proud of this, and I would not have done if I had not felt, by then, that I was living with a low-level emergency that no one else could see. His wallet, the usual cards, his license with his face on it, a folded piece of paper with my mother's address on it in his handwriting. But the handwriting had no loop on the T. His desk, notebooks from work with dates going back 2 years, and in the older ones the handwriting was the one I knew, and in the notebooks from the last 4 or 5 months the handwriting was different in the specific way that signatures were different. Same letter forms, same general character, but the loop missing from the T and a slight difference in how the lowercase r closed that I had never noticed before because I had no reason to notice it before. I photographed pages side by side on my phone. I sat on the floor of his office and I looked at the photographs and I thought about what produces that kind of change. Not a gradual drift, but a discrete shift, a before and after with a line between them. The recording was from our anniversary 2 years ago. I found it in my phone's camera roll while I was looking for the handwriting photos. A video I'd taken at dinner. 40 seconds of Thomas laughing at something I'd said, holding his coffee cup with both hands. And when the check came, he signed the receipt and I caught it on the edge of the frame, and I zoomed in later and there it was, the loop, clear and specific in his. I watched that 40-second video 11 times. Then I went and sat across from my husband at the kitchen table, and I put my phone between us with the video playing and I watched his face. He watched the video. He watched himself in it, laughing, holding the cup. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he looked up at me, and the thing I can't fully describe is what happened to his face in that moment. It went through something, like a reorganization, like something behind it was deciding how to arrange it, and what it settled on was not quite any expression I'd seen on Thomas before. It was close. It was assembled correctly. But I had known his face for 9 years, and I knew the difference between his face and a version of his face, the way you know a copy of a photograph is a copy even when it's a good one. He said, "I know this is frightening." He didn't say, "What do you mean?" or "I don't understand what you're showing me," or any of the things the Thomas I knew would have said. He said, "I know this is frightening, which meant he knew what I was asking, which meant there was no version of this where I had been wrong about what I'd seen. I asked him where Thomas was. I said it plainly. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said that Thomas was not in pain, that the transition had not involved pain, that Thomas had not been frightened. I asked what transition meant. He said he couldn't explain it in terms I would be able to hold, which is a specific kind of answer that I have thought about every day since, because it implies there is a way to explain it, just not to me, not in language I had access to. I asked if Thomas was coming back. He said he is not separate from me in the way you're imagining. I asked what that meant. He said it means I have everything he had. I said that wasn't the same thing. He said, I know. I left that night. I went to Renata's and I told her everything, and she held my hands while I talked, and she said all the right things, and she let me sleep in her guest room. In the morning, she made coffee and sat across from me and said, carefully and kindly, that she was worried about me, that she thought I needed to talk to someone, that Thomas had called her the night before to check on me and he had sounded like himself, concerned and steady, and she thought whatever was happening between us was real, but that it was a marriage problem and not the thing I was describing. I went home 3 days later because I had nowhere else to go and because I had no proof that anyone who hadn't seen his face in that moment would accept as proof. He was there. He made dinner. He asked how Renata was. He held his coffee cup by the handle. That night I lay next to him in the dark listening to him breathe on his left side, and I thought about what he'd said. That Thomas was not separate from him in the way I was imagining, that he had everything Thomas had. I thought about the drawer in my mind and how full it was. I thought about the loop on the T and the face that knew how to arrange itself in the 40-second video of a man laughing at dinner who no longer existed in any form I could reach. That was 8 months ago. I still live here. I go to work and I come home and I cook meals and I watch television in the evenings, and I sleep next to something that holds its coffee cup wrong and signs its name without a loop and knows already what I'm frightened of before I say it. Renata thinks I'm doing better. My mother thinks therapy has helped, though I am not in therapy. Everyone who knows us thinks we are fine. He is very good at fine. The thing I think about most, the thing that lives in me like a splinter I can't reach, is something he said on the last night I tried to talk to him about it. I asked him why. Why come here? Why this life? Why Thomas? He considered the question with Thomas's face arranged in Thomas's thinking expression, the cheek-biting one, and then he said, because you make it easy to stay. I asked what that meant. He said, you notice things but you don't leave. You noticed the cup and the signature and the sleeping and you stayed. He said that's what we look for. People who notice but stay. I've been thinking about the word we for 8 months. I've been thinking about what requires a plural and why he used it without hesitating. I've been thinking about Renata's coffee cup the last time I visited, held in both hands even though it was summer, which was not how she had ever held a cup before, and the way she looked at me when I told her about the we. A look that lasted just a fraction too long before it rearranged itself into her normal expression. I've been thinking about my mother saying I shouldn't trust things that are going well, about my sister's voice on the phone, about all the people around me who say I am fine and Thomas is fine and nothing has changed, and I am thinking about the drawer and how much room is left in it, and whether noticing and staying is something that runs in families, and whether whatever looks for that quality has already found more than one of us, and has been here, settled and patient and well arranged, for longer than I have understood. I am still noticing I have not left,